5 true scary stories from haunted hotels. Terrifying hotel ghost stories you won't forget. David had traveled the world countless times, seeking out new experiences, exploring cities drenched in history and mystery. But as his taxi rolled through the cobbled streets of New Orleans on a cold winter night, a sense of foreboding settled over him. The city, famous for its jazz, its cuisine, and its haunting tales of the supernatural, felt different tonight. The chill in the air, the sound of the wind whipping through the narrow alleyways, all combined to create a strange weight on his chest, an inexplicable feeling that this trip was going to be unlike any he had taken before. He had arrived at his destination, the Crescent Hotel, a grand yet faded monument to the past. Situated on a quiet street near the heart of the French Quarter, the hotel was a relic of old New Orleans. Its ironwork balconies twisting with the rust of age, its brick walls worn smooth by decades of hurricanes and time. It had been a place of luxury in its prime, and though it had seen better days, it still commanded a certain respect. David had made his reservations weeks in advance. He had read the reviews, and despite a few mentions of odd occurrences, doors that creaked open by themselves, whispers in empty hallways and flickering lights, he brushed them off as mere exaggerations, the product of overactive imaginations. But as the car came to a stop, and he stared at the tall, shadowed building before him, something in the back of his mind couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps there was some truth to those stories. The bellhop, an older man with a weathered face, ushered him inside. The lobby smelled faintly of incense and old wood, a scent that lingered in the air as though the walls themselves were absorbing the history of the place. David took a deep breath and approached the front desk, where an elderly woman with silver-gray hair sat. Her sharp, pale eyes seemed to pierce right through him as she looked up. "Welcome to the Crescent," she said in a soft voice that seemed to echo in the empty lobby. Her hands were wrinkled, her movements slow but deliberate, as if she had been here far too long to be in any hurry. "Your name, sir?" "David Green," he replied, glancing at the aged decor surrounding him. Antique chandeliers, heavy velvet curtains, and a grand staircase that spiraled up in a shadowed darkness. She nodded, tapping keys on the ancient computer before her. As she handed him the room key, her eyes flickered momentarily to the front doors, as though waiting for something or someone to enter. "Enjoy your stay, Mr. Green," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But there's one thing I must tell you." Her gaze locked with his. "Some rooms should be left alone." David smiled politely, dismissing her words as the ramblings of an old woman. He had heard similar warnings before in places like these. Superstition, he thought, nothing more. As he made his way to the elevator, the bellhop had already disappeared into the shadows, and the hotel seemed eerily silent. David couldn't help but notice that the air felt colder here, as if the building itself was exhaling a chill, one that seemed to seep into his very bones. He shrugged off the discomfort and pressed the button for the 5th floor, determined to settle in and relax. But as the elevator doors slid shut, David felt a prickle at the back of his neck, an unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. He glanced around the elevator, a small, claustrophobic space, and as the doors closed with a soft, metallic clunk, a whisper tickled his ear. It was faint, barely audible, but David's eyes widened. He couldn't make out the words, but he could feel the urgency in the voice, as if it was trying to warn him. The elevator jerked, the lights flickered once, and then it was still again. When David reached the 5th floor, he stepped out into a dim hallway lined with old portraits, their eyes following him as he walked down the corridor. The hotel felt like a place frozen in time, frozen but not quiet. There was an undercurrent of whispers, a strange hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The walls seemed to breathe. He took a deep breath and approached his room. As he unlocked the door and entered, the strange hum faded, and the room before him appeared warm and inviting. But something in the back of his mind wouldn't let him shake the feeling that he was being watched. He tried to shake off the unease, but as the door clicked shut behind him, David couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something here, something old, something buried. And for the first time in his life, David wondered if he had made a terrible mistake by choosing this particular hotel. The air grew thicker as he dropped his bag on the bed. He heard the faintest rustle, like a page turning in the next room, but when he glanced around, there was no one there. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought, but the feeling persisted. He wasn't alone. The stories, they were everywhere. He'd overheard guests at the front desk talking about their experiences, about things they had seen, heard, or felt, things that couldn't be explained by logic. Whispers of ghosts, of rooms that were never meant to be opened, of an ancient presence in the building, one that had claimed countless lives over the years. David sat on the edge of the bed, his fingers absently tracing the edge of the old bedspread. That's when it hit him. He had heard stories like these in other places, tales told over drinks and in hushed tones at bar counters. But this time it felt different. He wasn't just hearing stories. He was standing in the middle of one. The sounds of the hotel began to warp and twist, as if it was alive, shifting around him. David had unknowingly entered a place where reality seemed to bend. And as he lay back in the bed, the whispers came again, this time louder, clearer. But it wasn't just the whispers he heard. He heard the stories. 5 stories. 5 terrifying accounts of the hotel's dark history. And as David drifted into an uneasy sleep, he knew that somehow these stories were his now. They were waiting for him, beckoning him to uncover the truths that had been hidden for far too long. He had no idea just how far down the rabbit hole he was about to fall. Story 1. The room that shouldn't exist. Rebecca had always been drawn to the darker side of history. A journalist by trade, she was no stranger to investigating the supernatural, haunted landmarks, eerie places, and long-forgotten stories. Her latest assignment had brought her to New Orleans, a city as rich in mystery as it was in culture. Famous for its French Quarter and jazz music, it was also a place where the whispers of ghosts and spirits lingered in every shadow. Her destination was the Crescent Hotel, an establishment known not just for its faded elegance, but for its peculiarities. In a city that boasted its share of haunted sites, this hotel was an enigma. Though its history was tinged with stories of ghostly apparitions and inexplicable disappearances, the hotel remained largely a quiet fixture in New Orleans' haunting landscape. Rebecca had already visited several other landmarks, gathering interviews, collecting anecdotes, but the Crescent Hotel intrigued her the most. There were rumors, hushed voices in the lobby, murmurs about a room that didn't appear on any of the hotel's maps. Room 1408, they called it. This room was elusive, its existence questioned by all who worked there. No one had ever been able to locate it on the official floor plans, and guests who stayed there often had strange experiences, but none could explain what made the room so peculiar. Some said it didn't even appear in the hotel's booking system. Others claimed it was hidden behind a door that shouldn't have been there. Intrigued by the mystery, Rebecca made a decision. She would uncover the truth. The first hint came when Rebecca was casually chatting with a bellboy at the front desk. He seemed uneasy as she asked about the room. After a long pause, he glanced over his shoulder before quietly muttering, "I can show you, ma'am. But I warn you, no one ever stays in that room long enough to tell the tale." His words only fueled her curiosity. The bellboy led her through the winding corridors of the hotel, far from the main lobby and away from the usual rooms. The hallways grew narrower, the walls more worn, till they reached a small, unmarked door at the end of a forgotten hallway. It was the kind of door that was never meant to be opened, an afterthought in a building of grandeur. The bellboy unlocked it with an old brass key, and as the door creaked open, a cold gust of air rushed out, despite the warmth of the hotel. Rebecca stepped inside, and her heart skipped a beat. The room was unlike any she had seen. It looked as if it had been frozen in time, untouched by the years that had weathered the rest of the building. Old, dust-covered furniture filled the space. A bed draped in a faded quilt, an antique wardrobe that seemed to sag under the weight of its own age, and a cracked mirror that reflected nothing but shadows. The room was lit only by flickering candles that seemed to burn eternally, casting an eerie, soft glow that only added to the unnatural stillness of the space. Everything about the room screamed disrepair, but there was something more unsettling than just decay. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Rebecca could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the weight of something ancient, something forgotten. The bellboy stood in the doorway, eyeing her nervously. "Don't stay too long," he warned. "People who do, they don't always come back the same." Ignoring his advice, Rebecca decided to stay and explore. She carefully examined the room, noting the strange stillness of it all. The air felt stagnant, as if time itself had been trapped within these walls. The heavy curtains, the bedspread, the furniture, all of it seemed to be from another era, as though the room had been abandoned in the early 1900s and never touched again. As she wandered deeper into the room, Rebecca stumbled upon a small wooden box hidden beneath the bed. Curiosity piqued, she pried it open. Inside, there was an old journal, the pages yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. The journal's entries were written in a hurried, scrawling hand, and as Rebecca flipped through the pages, a sense of unease settled over her. The words spoke of something she couldn't quite grasp, a gateway. The journal's author described the room as a doorway to another dimension, a place where time warped and spirits lingered. According to the journal, those who stayed in the room were drawn into a reality that was not their own, where the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred. The room was a holding place for those who had disappeared from the world, trapped in a timeless limbo. Many had stayed, but few had returned. Those who had were never quite the same. Rebecca's pulse quickened as she read on. The more she learned, the more she felt the room pulling at her. Her head began to ache, a dull throb behind her eyes that intensified with every turn of the page. The candlelight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. The temperature in the room dropped further, her breath now visible in the air. Suddenly, a voice echoed through her mind. It was faint at first, like a whisper just beyond her hearing, but then it grew louder, more insistent. "Leave, while you can." Rebecca's heart raced as she tried to shake the voice from her mind, but the weight of the room, the oppressive stillness, seemed to grow heavier. She shoved the journal in her bag and stood to leave, but as she approached the door, the room shifted. The walls seemed to warp, stretching and contracting, and the very air seemed to twist around her. The door that had once been behind her was now a distant memory, lost in the shifting space. Panic surged through her, and she turned in every direction, but there was no exit. The room was alive in a way she couldn't understand. Then, as quickly as it began, the room snapped back into place. The door reappeared, as though nothing had changed. Rebecca stumbled forward, desperate to escape the grip of the room, and as she opened the door, she could feel the cold air of the hallway wash over her. She hurried down the corridor, back to the safety of the hotel lobby, her mind spinning with the haunting revelation she had just uncovered. But as she stood in the lobby, trying to steady her breath, something felt different. The atmosphere in the hotel had changed, darker, more oppressive. The familiar sounds of the bustling lobby, the soft murmur of guests, had faded into a distant hum. And then she realized it. Something had followed her. Rebecca wasn't sure what it was, but she could feel it, a presence lingering just behind her like a shadow in her peripheral vision. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was nothing there. Still, the feeling remained, heavy and suffocating. She had brought something back with her from that room, and no matter how far she ran, she knew it would follow her, forever. Story 2. The Crying Ghost in the Hallway. Jack and Emily had dreamed of this honeymoon for years, and New Orleans, with its historic charm and romantic atmosphere, was the perfect destination. They had booked a stay at the Crescent Hotel, drawn in by its age-old elegance and the stories whispered by locals about its haunted history. As they entered room 14, the antique furniture and ornate details gave the room a sense of timelessness. But it wasn't long before a strange presence began to make itself known. The first night was peaceful. They marveled at the city lights twinkling through the window, and after a quiet dinner, they fell asleep in each other's arms. But at midnight, something stirred. A soft, almost imperceptible sound filled the air. A faint, sorrowful cry that seemed to echo through the walls of the hotel. At first, Jack and Emily dismissed it as the wind or the creaking of the old building settling. After all, they were staying in a hotel that had stood for over a century, and old buildings often made noises at night. But night after night, the crying grew more distinct. Each evening, as the clock struck 12, the sound would begin, a soft sobbing, like the mourning of someone who had lost everything. The cries reverberated through the walls of the room, rising and falling in pitch, just enough to be unsettling, but not enough to be identified. On the third night, Jack's patience wore thin. The sound, a constant reminder of something painful and tragic, gnawed at his nerves. He sat up in bed, glancing at Emily, who was still asleep beside him, her face serene, unaware of the growing unease in the room. He slipped out of bed and made his way toward the door. The hallway was empty, bathed in the cold, muted glow of antique lamps that flickered like candles in the distance. Jack walked slowly, following the sound of the crying. It seemed to be coming from further down the hallway, from the shadowy corner of the hotel. As he moved closer, the sound became louder, more anguished. It was unmistakably the sound of a woman weeping, her cries filled with despair. As Jack turned the corner, the hallway stretched before him, empty except for the eerie glow of the flickering lights. Then he saw it. At the end of the corridor, there was a large, ornate mirror hanging on the wall, its surface slightly clouded by age. At first, he thought he was seeing things, but then the reflection caught his eye. The woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her face obscured by the tangled mass of her dark hair, appeared in the mirror. Her eyes were swollen, red from crying, and her face was pale with grief. She stood there, staring at him with an expression that was at once sorrowful and accusing. Before Jack could even react, the ghostly figure reached out toward him, her hand trembling in the air. In that moment, a chill ran down Jack's spine, and he instinctively took a step back. His heart raced in his chest. The cries continued, now growing louder, almost deafening in their intensity. He reached out a hand to touch the mirror, but before he could make contact with the reflection, the figure vanished, gone, as though she had never been there at all. Jack stood frozen in the hallway, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The crying had stopped, and the mirror before him was empty once again, reflecting only the dim light of the hallway. But he could still feel the weight of her presence, like a shadow lingering in the air. He didn't know what to think or feel. His mind raced with questions. What had he just seen? Was it a trick of the light, or had he truly witnessed something supernatural? He returned to room 14, his mind reeling, but Emily was still asleep, oblivious to the terror he had just encountered. He climbed back into bed, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The hotel, once a romantic getaway, now felt like a prison, each hallway and corner hiding secrets that he was not ready to uncover. The following day, Emily seemed unaware of the events that had unfolded the night before. She was excited to explore the city, but Jack remained distant, his mind haunted by the apparition in the hallway. He decided not to tell Emily about the ghostly encounter. What if it was just a hallucination? After all, they were in a hotel known for its haunted reputation. Maybe it was nothing more than an overactive imagination. Yet the image of the woman's tear-streaked face lingered, refusing to fade. That night, as midnight approached, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, but the sobbing came again, soft at first, then gradually growing louder, filling the room with its sorrowful wail. Jack knew he had to investigate again, but this time he wasn't sure if he was ready to face whatever waited for him in the hotel's haunted halls. This time, Emily woke up to the sound of the crying. She was no longer the innocent, excited bride she had been just days earlier. There was fear in her eyes, the same fear that had gripped Jack's heart the previous night. She whispered to him, "Jack, do you hear that? The crying. It sounds like someone's in pain." Jack nodded grimly. "It's coming from down the hall." They ventured together into the hallway, the air growing colder as they moved toward the source of the cries. As they passed the large mirror where Jack had seen the ghost, Emily froze. Her breath caught in her throat, and she let out a soft gasp. "Jack, look," she whispered, pointing toward the reflection. The woman was there again, her eyes swollen with tears, her mouth open in a silent scream. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped closer to the mirror, and Jack felt a chill rise from his feet to his chest. Something was wrong. The mirror seemed to shimmer, and for a moment, Jack thought he saw the figure move. Like it was alive, a spectral presence trapped in the glass. Emily reached for the mirror, but before her fingers could touch the surface, the figure vanished once again, leaving behind only the dim reflection of the hallway. Both of them stood there, shaken, their hearts beating in sync with the echoes of the ghost's cries. The next day, Emily did some research, uncovering a tragic story about the hotel. Years ago, a young woman named Elizabeth had stayed in the hotel with her child. She had been a guest of the hotel for months, seeking refuge after a series of devastating losses. Her child had fallen ill, and despite the best efforts of doctors, the child had died in the very room they had occupied. Elizabeth was devastated, and in her grief, she began to hear strange noises in the hotel. Some believed the child's spirit still lingered in the hotel, but Elizabeth was convinced that someone in the hotel was responsible for her child's death. Emily read on, horrified. It turned out that Elizabeth's grief had transformed into madness. She had accused many people in the hotel of harming her child, but her accusations had gone unheard. Her cries for justice turned into something darker, a thirst for revenge. In her madness, Elizabeth had cursed the hotel, ensuring that her spirit would never rest until she had her revenge. Jack and Emily pieced it together. The ghost was Elizabeth, and it wasn't haunting them just for the sake of scaring them. It was after something. The spirit believed that Jack was the one who had caused her suffering in a previous life, a long-forgotten transgression that Elizabeth could never forgive. As they left the hotel, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't really escaping. The ghost of Elizabeth had followed them, believing Jack to be the source of her pain, and now she would haunt them both for the rest of their lives. The cries of a mother's grief, the echoes of a tragic past, would never let them go. Story 3. The Haunted Elevator. Carlos had always been a man of routine. His days revolved around meetings, presentations, and networking. The luxury of the Crescent Hotel, where he was staying for a business conference, offered the perfect environment for him to unwind after long days filled with corporate strategy sessions. But there was something about the hotel that unsettled him. It wasn't the grand architecture or the historical charm. It was the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Each morning, Carlos took the elevator to the conference rooms on the top floors. At first, the elevator seemed like nothing more than a standard hotel lift. The soft hum of its machinery was soothing, the occasional flicker of its lights providing a strange, almost hypnotic rhythm. But as the days passed, Carlos began to notice strange things about the elevator that didn't make sense. Most disturbing was how the elevator seemed to stop on floors that weren't listed on the directory. The first time it happened, Carlos assumed it was just a malfunction. The elevator doors had opened on the 13th floor, a floor that wasn't on the map he had seen at the front desk. He glanced at the directory again, but it remained unchanged, with no indication that there was a floor 13. Frowning, he pushed the button for the conference floor and let out a small sigh of relief when the elevator doors closed again. But the strange occurrences didn't stop there. Every morning, the elevator would take him on an unpredictable journey, halting on floors that didn't seem to exist. On each of these unexplained stops, the doors would open to reveal eerie, unnerving scenes. Long, dim hallways lined with dark portraits of forgotten faces, flickering lights that cast unsettling shadows, and the faint sound of footsteps that never seemed to belong to anyone. Carlos would quickly press the button to close the doors, heart racing, as though the elevator itself was conspiring to keep him from reaching his destination. It wasn't until the fourth night of his stay that Carlos truly began to understand the magnitude of the hotel's supernatural presence. He had just finished a late dinner, his thoughts consumed with the details of a meeting the next day, when he decided to return to his room. As he entered the lobby, the elevator beckoned him. His eyes flicked to the clock, nearly midnight. The long day had drained him, and the comfort of his room seemed like the only place to escape the growing unease in his chest. He stepped into the elevator, pushing the button for his floor. But to his horror, the doors closed on their own, and the elevator began its descent, far beyond the top floors of the hotel. The elevator passed through floors that didn't belong. Each stop seemed more surreal than the last. When the doors opened to reveal the basement level, Carlos felt an icy chill rush through him. The basement was not a part of the hotel's normal operations, and he had never heard any mention of it during his stay. He hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the close button, but something compelled him to step out. The basement was damp and suffocating, a far cry from the sleek and polished environment he had grown accustomed to. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive silence, and the walls were crumbling, as if the basement had not been visited in decades. The dim, flickering lights above cast eerie shadows across the worn, cracked tiles of the floor. As he ventured further, Carlos began to feel an inexplicable presence. Something was watching him. He turned a corner, his footsteps echoing in the stillness, and that's when he saw them. A group of figures, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, stood motionless in the middle of the basement, their eyes fixed on him. The men and women seemed out of place, as if they didn't belong in the modern world. Their faces were pale, their eyes lifeless, and they appeared frozen in time. Carlos took a hesitant step closer, and suddenly, the ghostly figures began to move. But they didn't move like normal people. They shuffled in a mechanical, repetitive manner, as though they were trapped in some kind of endless loop. Their expressions were twisted in agony, their mouths silently open in eternal screams, but no sound came from them. The flickering lights cast strange, jerky shadows that seemed to dance across the walls, heightening the sense of dread. Frozen in place, Carlos could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears as the figures approached him. One of them, a woman in a faded yellow dress, reached out with a trembling hand. Her eyes were full of sorrow, and Carlos felt an overwhelming wave of grief flood over him. It was as though her pain, her suffering, was being transmitted directly into him. The ghostly figures stepped closer, and Carlos realized with growing horror that he wasn't just observing them. He was being pulled into their world. Just as Carlos felt the weight of the ghost, sorrow threatened to suffocate him. A voice cut through the oppressive silence. It was a low, guttural whisper, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Leave this place. The elevator. It's not what you think." Carlos spun around to see a tall, spectral figure standing in the doorway. He could barely make out its features, but it was a man, his face pale and expressionless. He pointed a shaking finger toward the elevator, his voice trembling with urgency. "The elevator is a portal. It takes you to the past, takes you to this place, to this time where we are trapped. If you don't leave before midnight, you will never escape." The man's words hung in the air, their meaning sinking deep into Carlos's bones. He had only one chance. If he didn't leave now, he would be condemned to join the ghosts in their endless torment, forever trapped in the hotel's dark, twisted history. Panic surged through Carlos as he turned and bolted for the elevator. He could feel the eyes of the ghosts on him as he ran, their empty stares burning into his back. As he reached the elevator, the doors opened automatically. But as he stepped inside, the elevator didn't move. The air was thick with a strange energy, and Carlos could hear whispers, voices from the past that clamored for his attention, trying to pull him into their world. He pressed the button for his floor, but the elevator didn't respond. The doors closed on their own, and for a moment, Carlos thought he was trapped. The elevator was silent, and the lights flickered ominously. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, the elevator began its ascent. The world outside the elevator changed. The walls of the hotel flickered, like the images on an old film reel, and the elevator seemed to stretch, elongating the passage of time. Carlos's heart raced as he struggled to breathe, the sounds of the past growing louder with every passing second. It was as if the hotel itself was fighting against him, trying to pull him back into its dark, unyielding grip. Finally, with a sharp lurch, the elevator doors opened, and Carlos was back in the lobby. The air was normal again, the world outside the elevator clear and real. But as Carlos stepped out, he felt a deep sense of unease, a lingering weight on his chest. The basement, the ghosts, the warnings, they felt like distant memories, but he knew, deep down, that the hotel's grip on him had not loosened. It was only a matter of time before the elevator would call to him again, pulling him into its dark past once more. Carlos left the Crescent Hotel the next morning, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the elevators still awaited him, hidden in the shadows of the hotel. The ghosts were still there, their suffering eternal, and he knew that the next time he stepped into the elevator, he might not be so lucky. The past had a way of holding on, and the hotel was a place where time had no meaning. Story 4. A Warning from the Dead. Catherine sat in the plush armchair by the window, the pale light of dawn barely illuminating the dark wood of the hotel room. The stillness of the room seemed to press in on her, just like the weight in her chest. It had been 3 months since her husband, Thomas, had died. The pain of his sudden loss hadn't eased, and the overwhelming emptiness of life without him was a constant ache. Despite the well-meaning sympathy of friends and family, she felt more alone than ever. The Crescent Hotel was supposed to be a place of respite, a sanctuary where she could find some peace. The hotel's eerie, old-world charm had drawn her in, its long, shadowy hallways and high-ceilinged rooms, each with a story to tell. Catherine had come to New Orleans in the hopes of finding solace, perhaps even closure, though she didn't know how or where to start. Her mind kept circling back to Thomas and the strange circumstances surrounding his death. Something about it never quite felt right. But there was nothing she could do to change it, she thought, and perhaps it was time to move forward, to let the past slip away. That was, until she woke up to a mysterious letter slid under the door one morning. The letter was old-fashioned, written on thick parchment in a delicate, almost regal handwriting. It was addressed to her, but there was no return address. Catherine frowned, wondering who would send her such an odd, unsolicited note. When she opened it, she found that the message was brief but chilling. You don't know the truth about your husband. He is not dead. He has been lost to the darkness that runs through these halls. Follow the clues, and you will understand. But beware, for the dead are never truly gone. They wait, and they watch. You are next. Catherine's heart raced as she read the letter again, her hands trembling. She couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was at play here, but she couldn't make sense of it. Who could have sent such a letter? And what did it mean by the darkness that runs through these halls? Her mind flashed back to the night Thomas had died. He had been a seemingly healthy man, at least on the surface. One day, he simply collapsed at work, and despite the best efforts of doctors, he passed away unexpectedly. Catherine had never believed the cause was natural. There had been no warning signs, no previous health problems, just a sudden, unexplained death. And then, there had been the strange note he had left behind, written hastily in his handwriting. They found me. You must leave, Catherine. It's too late for me. It had never made sense to her. That note had always nagged at her, haunting her long after Thomas was gone. She hadn't told anyone about it, assuming it was just the ramblings of a man on his deathbed. But now, after reading the letter under her door, she couldn't ignore the possibility that there was more to Thomas's death than she'd ever realized. Determined to uncover the truth, Catherine set out to follow the clues the letter promised. The hotel, with its labyrinthine hallways and hidden corners, seemed to be a perfect place for secrets to be buried. She began by exploring the parts of the hotel she had never noticed before. The forgotten, crumbling corridors and forgotten staircases that seemed to lead nowhere. One evening, after hours of wandering the hotel, she stumbled upon a hidden door in the back of the hotel's grand ballroom. It was tucked away behind an old tapestry, the wood creaking as she pushed it open. The room beyond was dark, musty, and filled with the scent of age. Dust coated the floor, and the furniture was draped in white sheets, as though it had been abandoned for decades. But as Catherine stepped further into the room, her eyes were drawn to something strange in the corner, a large wooden chest. With trembling hands, she opened the chest, revealing stacks of old photographs and faded papers. She flipped through them, each one telling a story of a time long past, of people long gone. But then one photograph caught her attention. It was of Thomas, standing among a group of men and women, their faces twisted in strange expressions of joy and menace. Behind them, a shadowy figure loomed, its features obscured. The caption beneath the photo read, "The Cult of the Crescent, the Final Gathering." Catherine's stomach churned as she read the words. The cult? She had heard whispers in the town about strange rituals, about people disappearing without a trace. But she had never imagined Thomas could have been involved in something like this. She flipped through more photographs, each one more disturbing than the last. In one, Thomas stood next to a rogue figure, their hands raised in some sort of twisted salute. The others around them were similarly dressed, their faces obscured by hoods, but their eyes were unmistakable. There was something cold and inhuman about their expressions. Catherine's hands shook as she continued to sift through the papers. Among them were records, some handwritten and others typed, detailing the activities of the cult, ceremonies, their beliefs, and most disturbing of all, their rituals designed to summon dark forces. The records hinted at a terrifying truth. The cult had been operating in the hotel for decades, drawing in people from all over the world. The members had believed that by sacrificing their own, they could unlock the door to immortality and power, a gateway to an otherworldly realm. And the most chilling part of all was the mention of a ritual that would allow the dead to rise again, if the conditions were just right. As Catherine read the final page, she realized with horror that Thomas had been more than just a victim. He had been an integral part of the cult's workings, someone who had willingly given himself to their cause. The letter under her door hadn't been sent by some mysterious stranger. It had been a warning from the dead, a warning sent by Thomas himself. Suddenly, Catherine heard a noise behind her, a faint whisper, like the rustling of paper. She spun around, but the room was empty, save for the photos and papers strewn around her. And then, slowly, she saw something move in the shadows, something dark and indistinct, flickering in and out of existence. It wasn't a person, but a presence, a thing that seemed to shift with the darkness. The temperature in the room dropped, and Catherine felt an icy breath on the back of her neck. A voice echoed in her mind, a voice she recognized. Catherine, it's too late. Her blood ran cold as she turned toward the voice. There, standing in the doorway, was Thomas, alive but not alive. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and waxy, and his once kind face was now twisted in an unnatural grin. "I never left, Catherine. I've been here all along, waiting for you to join me." The truth was unbearable. Catherine realized with sickening certainty that Thomas had never truly died. He had been brought back, part of the cult's unholy pact, and now it was her turn to join him. The hotel's dark power had claimed him, and it was now claiming her. Before she could react, the room around her began to distort, the walls closing in as the shadows crept toward her. Catherine screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing she saw before everything went black was Thomas's outstretched hand, beckoning her into the void. And with that, she was gone. The hotel's secrets had claimed yet another soul, and the cycle would continue. The dead were never truly gone. They merely waited. Story 5. The Vengeful Spirit in Room 13. David had always been a man of logic, a skeptic who didn't believe in the supernatural or any of the ghost stories people like to tell. But when he arrived at the Crescent Hotel for a business trip, something about the place gave him an uneasy feeling. The hotel was old, its architecture imposing with long, creaking hallways and rooms that seemed to hold secrets in every corner. He had heard the rumors, the ones about Room 13, but he never took them seriously. That is, until he was assigned to stay there. Room 13 had earned a sinister reputation in the town. Many years ago, a violent murder-suicide had taken place within those very walls. The killer, a man named Richard Bellamy, had gone mad after a failed affair and murdered his wife in a brutal rage before taking his own life. Since then, guests reported feeling a presence in the room, cold, oppressive, and malevolent. Some claimed to hear faint whispers at night, while others swore that the air grew thick with the smell of blood. But David, ever the skeptic, dismissed these tales as nothing more than exaggerated folklore. After checking into the hotel, David was led to room 13. The door creaked as he entered, the dim light from a solitary lamp barely illuminating the room. The wallpaper, faded and peeling, gave the place a sense of age and neglect. The furniture was worn, the bed sheets stained with time. Yet despite the dinginess, David didn't feel afraid. He threw his suitcase onto the bed and shrugged off the feeling that lingered in the air. It was just an old room in an old hotel, he told himself. Nothing more. That night, after a long day of meetings, David retired to his room. The exhaustion from the trip weighed heavily on him, and he quickly fell into a deep sleep. But sleep in room 13 was not as peaceful as he had hoped. His dreams were dark, a twisted and chaotic blur of images. He saw a man, tall, with wild eyes and a face twisted with rage. The man chased him through the hallways of the hotel, his footsteps echoing louder and louder, until David's heart pounded in his chest. He ran, desperately trying to escape, but the man was always just behind him. The fear in the dream was suffocating, and no matter how fast David ran, he couldn't outrun the terror that pursued him. Suddenly, David woke up with a start, gasping for air. Sweat soaked his sheets, and his pulse raced. The room was still and silent, the darkness pressing in around him. He glanced at the clock. It was 3:07 a.m. The air in the room was thick, unnaturally cold. David sat up in bed, his mind still fogged by the remnants of the nightmare. But then something caught his eye. He turned his head to the wall beside the bed, and there, smeared across the pale wallpaper, were streaks of dark red. His heart skipped a beat. Blood. It was blood, fresh and oozing, dripping down in small rivulets. But the strangest thing was the writing, scratched into the wall in jagged, frantic letters. "Leave now. You're not safe here." David's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the chill of the room seeping into his bones, the oppressive weight of something unseen pressing against him. He leaped from the bed and rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. He tugged at the handle, but it was stuck, as if the room itself were refusing to let him leave. Panic set in, and David's mind raced. He backed away from the door, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. As he turned, he froze. There in the corner of the room, he saw something moving, a shadow, darker than the rest, twisting and shifting in unnatural ways. He could hear a faint whisper, barely audible, but it seemed to come from all directions. "You're here. You're one of us now." The voice was deep, guttural, filled with malice. David stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. His pulse hammered in his ears. His eyes flicked to the mirror across the room, and what he saw made his blood run cold. In the reflection, there was the figure of a man, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a twisted grin on his face. He was standing directly behind David, yet when David turned around, no one was there. The room seemed to close in on him. His breathing grew shallow as his head spun with confusion. What was happening? Was he hallucinating? Was this the result of the stress from the trip? But no, something was terribly wrong. He could feel it deep in his bones. As the minutes ticked by, the room seemed to grow colder, the air more suffocating. The whispering voice continued, growing louder with each passing moment, as though it was trying to force its way into David's mind. He clutched his head, trying to block it out, but it was impossible. The voice spoke again, this time more urgently. "You don't remember, do you?" David's eyes widened. What was it talking about? He was losing his grip on reality, and yet, some part of him recognized the truth in the voice. There was something he had forgotten, something buried deep inside. In a burst of clarity, memories came flooding back to him. His father's warnings, the strange feeling he'd had when he first entered the hotel, the odd connection he felt to room 13, and then it hit him. The man in his dreams, the man chasing him. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was Richard Bellamy, the killer who had murdered his wife all those years ago. David had been dreaming of the very man whose vengeful spirit haunted the room. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The blood on the walls, the scratching warnings, the twisted reflection in the mirror. It wasn't just happening to him. It was happening because of him. David gasped, his mind reeling. The truth was impossible to deny. He wasn't just staying in the haunted room 13. He was becoming part of its cursed history. Somehow, in some twisted, supernatural way, he had become Richard Bellamy. The hotel's dark energy had fused him with the vengeful spirit of the killer, transforming him into the very monster who had once walked those halls, filled with rage and grief. The realization hit David with the force of a freight train. He wasn't a guest in room 13 anymore. He was a part of its tragic story. The spirit of Richard Bellamy had claimed him, trapped him in an eternal cycle of violence and suffering. In the final moments, as the darkness closed in around him, David screamed, not in terror, but in resignation. The vengeful spirit that had haunted room 13 for years had finally found its next victim, and David had unknowingly walked right into its grasp. As the last shred of his consciousness faded away, he realized with chilling clarity that he would never leave room 13. He had become the thing he had feared most. And now, it was his turn to haunt the room, to chase the next guest who dared enter. And the cycle would continue forever. David had never been a believer in the supernatural. But after everything he had witnessed in the Crescent Hotel, his entire worldview had shattered. The hotel was not merely a building with a history. It was alive, a sentient entity that fed on the fear, guilt, and trauma of its guests. Each dark tale he'd uncovered was not a mere anomaly or coincidence. It was a piece of a far more sinister puzzle that had been carefully crafted over the decades, a macabre tapestry woven from the lives and deaths of those who had stayed there. The stories of the haunted elevator, the crying ghost in the hallway, the warning from the dead, and the vengeful spirit in room 13. They were all connected. Each one represented a soul trapped by the hotel's unrelenting grasp, cursed to relive their suffering over and over again. And David, through his own tragic experience, had unwittingly become part of that cursed history. As David staggered down the cold, dimly lit hallways of the hotel, his thoughts churned like a storm. The walls seemed to close in on him, the whispers growing louder with every step. The faces of those trapped in the hotel's eternal cycle, people like Carlos, Catherine, and Jack and Emily, flashed before his mind's eye, all of them unknowingly drawn into the web spun by this ancient, malevolent force. They hadn't been chosen by accident. The hotel sought them out, feeding on their vulnerabilities, twisting their realities until they had no choice but to succumb to the horrors within its walls. The elevator had taken Carlos to his doom. The ghost had led Catherine to the dark secrets of her husband's past, and the crying ghost had tormented Jack and Emily, pulling them into a vicious cycle of revenge. Each one had thought they could escape, had hoped to leave with their lives intact. But the hotel had other plans. It was not simply a place. It was an anchor for the past, where the living were drawn into the darkness that had claimed so many before them. David's footsteps echoed as he walked past the closed doors of the rooms that had been the setting for so many tragedies. He had learned too much now, far more than anyone could ever hope to know and live. He had been warned by the spirits, guided by the terror of his own mind, but now it was too late. The hotel had marked him, just like it had marked all the others. It had claimed him body and soul, and no matter how hard he tried to break free, there would be no escape. He had thought he was merely a guest, someone passing through, oblivious to the true nature of the place. But now he understood. The hotel was not simply a structure. It was a parasite, thriving on the souls it captured, the fears it evoked. It was a prison built with walls of regret and floors of despair. And once it claimed you, there was no leaving. As David made his way back to room 13, where it all had started, he felt a sense of inevitability settle over him. His steps had slowed, each one weighted with the knowledge that he could never leave. The man in the mirror, the figure of Richard Bellamy, was him now, his body no longer his own, but a vessel for something far darker. The spirit had taken him, and he would carry its rage and sorrow forever. He reached the door of room 13 and stopped. The door creaked as if it recognized him. welcoming him back into its embrace. He had been running from it for so long, trying to deny what was happening to him. But now, standing in front of it, he knew the truth. He was part of the hotel's history now, just as those before him had been. The walls had claimed him, and there was no going back. The whispers in the hallway grew louder, more insistent, and David turned to face them. His mind was no longer his own, his body no longer just flesh and bone. The hotel had taken everything from him, and in return, he would become part of its eternal nightmare. As David stood in the doorway of room 13, a wave of understanding washed over him. He had been blind to the truth, like so many others who had passed through the hotel before him. The Crescent Hotel was not just a place. It was a nexus of suffering, a place where time bled together and the past never truly let go. Each guest, each soul, was bound to the hotel, forever connected by the trauma it had caused. The hotel didn't just house the dead, it fed on the living, drawing them in and slowly transforming them in a part of its dark legacy. David realized that the horrors he had experienced were not isolated incidents. They were part of something much bigger, a curse that had woven itself into the very fabric of the hotel. The elevator, the crying ghost, the warning letter, and the vengeful spirit, they were all pieces of the same puzzle. The guests, the ones who had lived through the terror, were not merely victims. They were all part of the hotel's design, and once they had entered, they had been marked. No matter how much they struggled or tried to leave, they would always be drawn back, swallowed by the same force that had ensnared them in the first place. David had thought he could escape, that by understanding the truth he could break free. But the truth was that there was no escaping the hotel. It was a living thing, a dark entity that fed on fear and regret. And once you became part of it, you were trapped forever. It claimed the souls of those who stayed too long, who allowed themselves to be consumed by its history. Those who tried to leave, like Carlos or Catherine, had only delayed the inevitable. And now David knew that he, too, was part of the hotel's eternal cycle. He would never be free. As the final remnants of his humanity faded, David felt himself slipping away. His consciousness blurred, merging with the spirits who had come before him. He could hear their voices, whispering in the shadows, their torment echoing in his mind. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that the hotel would continue to feed on the living. Those who stayed too long would never escape. They would become part of the hotel's dark tapestry, forever woven into its haunted history. And as David stepped into the darkness of room 13, he understood that this was his fate, to become just another thread in the fabric of terror that the Crescent Hotel had created.